Thank you. It's good to be with you again. Pleasure to see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of fellow warriors on this whole public access mission that we are all undertaking. I will start the presentation in a moment. I would also just like to say thank you for the invitation, because hearing from Commissioner Anderson and many of the ideas that he has for collective work between the Department of Transportation and DNR regarding these waysides and otherwise, I found really exciting. And I know that I'm going to be making some calls and seeing what we can do to work together. So thank you very much, Commissioner. Looking forward to collaborating with your team on making a lot of this possible. As we move into our presentation, I'd like to introduce one of my colleagues with me. This is Kara Moore. Kara Moore now helps me manage the PAD section, or Public Access Assertion and Defense section, with the Division of Mining, Land and Water, Alaska Department of Natural Resources. Kara and I started working together a few years ago, and honestly, that was in the top 5 best decisions I have ever made in my career, was hiring Kara for that. She is a 5th generation Alaskan. She was educated at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, got her master's degree there as well. She has worked before with us in our South Central regional office within DMLW DNR, and had done a great job there. She left to explore some opportunities in the private sector in consulting and whatnot before returning home to us. And now she helps run all of the operations of the Public Access Assertion and Defense team. And the way we're going to break up the presentation, Rod, if it works with you, I'm going to have Kara and Caleb as well, excuse me, Kara talk about the first of our statehood defense work as it pertains to navigability. And then I'm going to talk about our RS-2477 work and some other special projects that relate to statehood defense that we're excited about as opportunities for the state, and hopefully you will be as well. So let me turn the first part of the presentation over to Kara.
Thanks. Quite the introduction. So yeah, I joined the PAD team in 2019, and now sort of Jim's right-hand woman. So this is work I'm really passionate about. I'm also a recreator, hunter, all the things Alaska, and there's a lot of work to do. It's sort of job security, you know, but I think some of the different things that we've been working over the last few years and just adding and adding and adding, we're getting more momentum, and maybe we'll make progress to where I'm not thinking about my kids' doing this same work in the same ways we're doing it now. So go ahead. Yeah, huge. We're a huge state, so many miles of navigable rivers, so many acres of navigable lakes. We're looking at 800,000 miles of navigable rivers. So at statehood, under the Equal Footing Doctrine, we automatically got title to all our submerged lands, other than the ones that were subject to valid pre-statehood withdrawals. The problem we have in Alaska is that the federal government often clouds our title on those lands. So that's where a lot of our work comes in. Federal conservation system units were created. The ones post-statehood did not actually acquire those submerged lands. Those belong to the state. And that's a section that we have targeted a lot of our work in the last decade, few years. Next slide. So just to go over some of the areas that we do own the submerged lands that maybe aren't obvious at first: Noatak National Preserve, Kobuk Valley National Park, Bering Land Bridge, Denali National Park. Now, Old Denali or Mount McKinley National Park, that's a valid pre-statehood withdrawal, so we don't own those. which we can show you on a map. It's kind of the same situation with the Glacier Bay National Park, the pre-statehood portion we don't, as well as Katmai. We do own Kenai Fjords National Park submerged navigable waters, same with Gates of the Arctic, Lake Clark, Yukon Charlie Rivers. Same thing with Fish and Wildlife Service. The bulk of those lands are post-statehood, so they'd be considered ANILCA, and that means that the state of Alaska owns the navigable waters. There are, again, some valid pre-statehood withdrawals inside that, but the bulk of it is state. Same situation for the Forest Service, the Tongass and the Chugach National Forest, and the regular BLM lands.
If I could jump in, I know several of you are very interested in the Katmai backcountry management plan that is is in the works for the federal government right now. We're very aware of that situation, and it points up these exact issues that Kara's discussing, where that core center of Katmai is a valid pre-statehood withdrawal, but all of the later additions through ANILCA and otherwise, those submerged lands belong to the state of Alaska. And so we are working closely with our colleagues at Fish and Game, also hearing from folks in the community about how important those areas are to them. But again, sorry for the interruption, Kara, but that's one point where this is a particularly important distinction, that we have to stand hard for Alaskan rights on those submerged lands that belong to us, even though they may be found within federal boundaries, technically.
Yeah, and it's very nuanced and difficult to tell what is what with those valid pre-statehood withdrawals. So we have, over the last few years, finally developed a lot of the pieces of the map layers, so members of the public can actually go look, where is that water that is federal? Where is that water that's state? We actually published that for all of our national parks and the entire U.S. Forest Service, as well as Tetlin National Wildlife Refuge. We're working right now on the rest of the refuges, hopefully late 2023 or 2024 we'll be done with the refuges, and then we'll eventually move on to regular BLM lands. So areas like Katmai that are really tricky, you can now drill down and look at exact spots and tell, okay, does the state say that this is navigable and then therefore the submerged lands belong to the state, or is it part of the national park? So is anyone have any questions about that?
This doesn't affect private property though, correct? So if I own 10 acres, there's a 4-acre lake on my property, does the state own the subsurface?
For lakes, generally lakes are navigable if they're 50 acres or more. So if you own property that is on a 50-acre or more lake, then it's probably navigable and owned by the people of Alaska. For those tiny pieces, there are times that if it's part of a large network, like a canoe route, it can be navigable, but generally those small ones are not. Now the water is still held in trust by the state of Alaska for its people, but the actual title to the bed of the lake would be whatever the survey shows on that. Does that make sense?
Yes and no. So if it's a small pond, then I guess I own it, but if I own 200 acres and there was a 50-acre lake on there, do you own it?
The state of Alaska does, yes.
Okay.
It kind of depends, 50 acres is kind of a rough, bright line.
Starting point.
Exactly.
Sure.
So there's nothing magical about 50 acres.
So I need to fill in 1 acre.
Right. The question is, could those, I didn't agree with that. I didn't agree with that.
I'm sure you heard.
This is being recorded, crank caller. No, I didn't say that. But with 50 acres, right, that's kind of just a general guideline, okay? If it is, the key thing is it or was it susceptible to being used as a highway of commerce. Now, a pocket lake standing alone out in the middle of nowhere, probably not if it's 50 acres, because someone who needed to get around it is more likely just to walk around it than to go to all the trouble of putting a boat in the water and navigating across it. On the other hand, as Carol was saying, if it is part of a larger waterway where you have small lakes joined together by smaller rivers and streams that together create this transportation network, you betcha it's navigable, right? So it's on a factual case-by-case basis when you're close to that water. But, you know, if you own property and have a 75-acre lake or a 100-acre lake on it, likelihood is great that it is, the submerged lands are owned by the state of Alaska.
If there's a historical record of navigation on it for any type of purpose that could be commercial, survey parties, things like that, that would also be evidence that it's navigable for title, and therefore the state owns the submerged lands.
Two questions. When you guys say submerged, does that start at the ordinary high water mark?
Yes.
And then second question, the majority of our 12 months, there's frozen conditions. Is navigable ice roads also?
No, navigable applies to unfrozen water. And all of our case law really backs up that it is, in the summertime, open water season. What are people doing and able to do when the water is liquid?
Well, for purposes of determining title to the
Yes.
submerged lands, right?
Yes.
You know, you look at water in its liquid state for navigability purposes. However, as you know, Mr. Arno will tell everyone, when it's in its frozen condition, and when you are only using the water column itself, something called the public trust doctrine kicks in, because the water itself belongs to all of us. And we are entitled to use those flowing waters, you know, for any lawful purpose, right? You know, as long as you are not, you know, building something that is attached to submerged land. So again, it's a nuanced question, but absolutely.
Regarding individual waters, there can be some interesting situations, so it's often better to just actually contact us. If you're looking at a specific thing, if you had a specific thing in mind, just ask us.
So I want to build a permanent duck line in the middle of my 50-acre lake. I need to get permission from the state.
Not necessarily on that point, but if you're looking for who owns the submerged lands.
Okay. I'm pushing a whole bunch of dirt this summer, that's it. 48 acres.
Okay. Can someone next slide me? Sir, yeah, go forward one. Yeah, so since 1959, when we became a state, up until now, we've been working a variety of ways to clear the title to our submerged lands. And right now, the federal government acknowledges about 9% of our submerged lands under our rivers, about 16% of those under our lakes. So, you know, not a ton of progress in those years, and that is why we're working and advancing some different ways to further the ball. Next slide. So statehood defense of our navigable waters. You guys have probably heard of the Governor's Unlocking Alaska initiative. A lot of these pieces fit inside that. Some of them we had in process before the Unlocking Alaska initiative. Some of them are since. So we will actually break all this down and talk in more depth about them, but some of them legislatively codify our navigable waters. Jim has been working really hard on that for the last year and a half. Intensify quiet title litigation against the federal government. We continue to file more and more cases on that. Talk about that in a future slide. Partnering with our users like you guys to document the navigable waters usage, because those go to our determinations that we write. We try to negotiate in good faith with federal authorities. We're also educating, energizing the public on state efforts for the federal failures. Heighten the number of RDI applications. That's a recordable disclaimer of interest. That's where we file paperwork with the BLM and say, we say it's navigable. Can you agree? Unfortunately, we're hitting, I think, year 4, where the only progress we've had on that is judicially mandated progress to them. So that is one of our in-process projects, but we've only filed 1 new RDI just because in 4 years, nothing else. So assert state management of submerged lands in federal areas. We'll talk more about that. That's something way in process. We're making, I think, quite a bit of traction on that one. And we have a new aggressive approach in state and federal land planning initiatives. We can speak to that. We have ongoing a new transportation management plan for the 40-mile area in a way of, okay, federal government, if you've not allowed us to get these step-down transportation plans, and that's just a kicking the can down the road, we will do our own, and we're in process on that. And then we've released our map of state-owned navigable waters in federal areas, which I spoke about already. That includes right now all our National Park Service areas, the Tongass and Chugach National Forest, and now we're starting our refuges. Next slide. So this is, of course, sort of Pat's bread and butter is our litigation against the federal government to quiet the title of our submerged lands. We have a number of ongoing cases. I'll just skim through those. The North Fork and the Middle Fork of the 40-mile. That's currently in process. The DOJ did disclaim the bulk of that area, which is where they say, you're right, you own it. There's 17 miles left of the upper North Fork. They probably were hoping that we would just settle and move on to other things, but we're continuing the case for that last 17 miles. So I think our last kind of in cross motions on that right now. The Middle Fork of the Kayak River, Bettles and Dietrich, that's also in process. The complaint is already filed. We're back and forth and working on discovery. Same status with the Mulchatna, Chillicothe-Dratna, Turquoise Lake, Twin Lakes. That is in process. We're working in the discovery stage on that. The Mendenhall River and Mendenhall Lake, that one's been in the news a little bit. Anyone has questions on that? That one is one of my projects, so that is in process as well. The rest are upcoming. The Resurrection River, Birch Creek, this is the one off the Steese, Sarkar Lake, and other waters on Prince of Wales Island. That's actually partly in process. Talakwana River, Necons River, Stony River, 2 lakes, Talakwana Lake, probably be filed this winter. The Nabesna River, Walker Lake and Kobuk Rivers. Next filing, isn't it?
We've got a 180-day notice that is expired on that, and the complaint will be filed at any time.
Yeah. The Noatak River, and can you bump back one more thing? Okay, and then forward. Yeah. So if you have any specific questions on these are kind of our in-process cases. Some are expired 180-day notices, but the complaint is not yet filed. And then the top chunk, we're actually in process on the case. Okay.
How are you picking which rivers we pick a fight for?
It comes down to a lot of different things.
We're all ears when it comes to which rivers and lakes we should be prioritized. We ask others in state government, where is it important to you in completing your mission to have that clarity of title that we can help bring through litigation? We also ask groups like this and members of this group, tell me about what rivers are important to you. When have you found yourself at loggerheads with overreaching federal authorities? where would it be important for you to have that clarity of title and state management and control through ownership of those waters? Anything that this group or individual members want to raise with us, we're all ears. We'll look into it, we'll explain land status to you. If we have case in controversy, which is an important requirement to have standing to bring the case, we can talk through all of those types of things. But we would love, love, love to have suggestions from this group.
Yeah, our Lake Clark National Park work, those cases actually are really because of user groups talking to us that was a problem. Some of the other things have other strategic reasons, but it really comes down to, we have a list of hundreds, and kind of whittling down what is strategically or important to the state or users for some reason at that point. So it's kind of a whole array of reasons behind why we chose what we chose.
And going back to that Katmai backcountry management plan that we get a lot of calls about, a lot of folks that are very interested in, those types of areas, we are looking closely at the waters that are not covered by the valid pre-statehood withdrawal at the core, but those that are within the later additions to prioritize whenever possible how we can be of assistance to the users. That is interesting. The Tetlin area, that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service area has been completed for our state ANILCA or state submerged lands in federal areas layer within that larger initiative that Kara was talking about. Also, Tetlin, our assessment of navigability in there is contained within the legislation that is now pending before the Alaska legislature, which is to get a plug in Senate Bill 92 and House Bill 98. The House bill is being sponsored by Representative Sadler, and the Senate bill is being sponsored by Senator Weasel. But those two bills, the Tetlin area is one of the ones in which we have identified and asserted state ownership, management, and control to many of the submerged lands in that refuge.
So when the state of Alaska is asserting authority on that water, it's clear from the direction of the searching case, what is the federal government and federal agencies? You say yes and they say no. What is their reason?
They use their own definition of navigability, which isn't in line with current case law, or maybe any case law. Jim, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah. It's kind of a Groundhog Day situation that we're having with them, going back to that movie with Bill Murray, right? Where we keep having the same arguments trotted out again and again and again. I'll give you, for instance, we look at the North Fork and the Middle Fork of the 40 Mile River, where we are in active litigation, okay? The federal government is clearly navigable, right? Long history of navigability. We have voted. I mean, it is, to me, a no-brainer of navigability. But to fight us, they installed gauges on both the North Fork and the Middle Fork of the 40 Mile River and maintained those USGS gauges for 2 years. Generally, that costs you about $100,000 per, okay? So we're talking at least, $400,000 right there. They retained a hydrologist who came up with this idea that this ridiculously large and behemoth boat was the criterion craft that was required under federal law to the tune of $1 million just to get through his deposition. And the thing about it is, if you go back, for those of you who are real students of this, to the Volcana case, where that listing of criteria craft was already there, there's much smaller boats that are criteria craft, and he even admitted in his deposition that my work is meaningless if something smaller is a criteria to grab. I mean, they just keep spending money after spending money, trotting out these whole tired, discarded arguments so that they can drag this out as long as possible. And then when we start going up the courthouse steps to get that good precedent in our favor, they go, oh, disclaim. Here is your disclaimer for it, because in their strategy, they can lose battle after battle after battle with us because they want to keep these discarded, tired, worn out theories that they're advancing from the light of a federal court decision. So that we keep having to say it the same, because again and again and again, they disclaim, they say you win, and they start the same thing over on a different river. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, one example from the 40-mile case is their hydrologist prepared everything based off a boat that drafts 21.5 to 25 inches. And, you know, most of our craft actually in Alaska that we're using recreationally drafts way less than 21 to 25 inches.
Well, I've never reading about one particular river that is part of being navigable because it's using commerce. And they were rolling with rafts up and down the river. And you know, its draw is what?
4 to 6 inches.
Yeah.
That's what we believe is supported by federal law.
Yeah, and so I have a question. I did pastor more than one of this. In one case, they were asserting that because there was no RDI, that the river wasn't navigable. And so, you know, I asked them point blank, are you saying that this river is not navigable? And I've got a tape. You know, is that the sort of thing that would be useful in us? Another case, it was on federal lands, undisputed navigable river, and I was landed on 3 times by a helicopter. The last 2 hours of daylight during the sun. And you know, he said, look, you're not doing anything illegal, but you really need to leave.
Yeah.
When you're saying navigable water, are you just talking about being able to take a boat up for transportation? Say you got a 2-mile wide river bottom floodplain where there's a trickle of water big enough to float a raft. Sometimes it's on one side, sometimes it's on the other, sometimes it's in the middle, sometimes there's 20 or 30 years between when water goes through there and stuff. Are you just talking about the waterway itself, or is all that land on a 2-mile bottom?
Well, really, so ordinary high down is kind of that entire devegetated plain. But when we're preparing a case, we are using whichever channel has water in it. And case law, we only stick to 70% of the open water season. It needs to be boatable. And so that's a lot of our waterways in Alaska.
So it's just a portion that's boatable 70% of the time.
Yes.
Generally, I think our hallmark is this. If you can float a boat one way, doesn't have to go both upstream and downstream, one way that draws 8 inches, okay? Needs an 8-foot wide channel. And you can do that for 1/3 of the open water season under federal law. That is what is navigable. I'll give you a few examples. You would ask about ephemeral waters. You know, some years they're deep enough, some years they're not. You know, those are a tougher call, right? But there is abundant case law, and it comes in the way of log drives, right? You know, where, you know, fell the timber, put it in the river, float it to market. You know, in those types of cases, there was one in the lower 48 on something called the Weaver River, where once every 7 years, there was sufficient flow in the river to sustain such a log drive from this point to market. And in that instance, the courts found that that was enough for it to be done. So it's a case-by-case thing, but the odds, you know, and all of the case law is very much in our favor of using small boats one way to establish.
Not for the purpose of being able to land a plane on a gravel bar in the water as well, or take it forward or anything like that?
There's unfortunately a case called Slot Bucket Lake, right? Slot Bucket Lake is a small lake in proximity to Lake Iliamna, right? And a number of years ago, back in the 1980s, a strategic decision was made that if we can show that taking off and landing a float plane is enough to establish the water as being a highway of commerce, we could clear title to the entire state quickly. So they put all their eggs in that one basket, hoping that the court would agree that that is a traditional and customary watercraft in Alaska, and that the use of float planes could be used to prove navigability. Sadly, the Ninth Circuit disagreed and said that float planes are not traditional and customary watercraft. So the use of planes with floats are helpful because we know how much water they need for those floats. But the actual, traffic by the plane itself is not going to get us where we need to.
I mean, a little bit.
Oh.
Oh.
And landing on gravel and.
Well, when the spring of the year, water levels are way down.
Yeah, right.
So there are lots of places you can land.
Mm-hmm.
If you're still below the ordinary high and it's a navigable water, then that is state land.
Yes.
So tracking back to the way we have sort of flipped our script, we are now just asserting ourselves as owners over the lands that we know that we own, and moving forward in ways like requiring federal authorities to permit their improvements on our lands. One example that we started with was Crescent Lake, and working with NPS, so they will, one, permit their stuff on our lands, but also two, we've taken over the permitting for the commercial operators on that lake, as it is a navigable lake. Next slide. So our navigable waters map that I had talked about, we are continually updating those layers, and we'll be adding our Fish and Wildlife Service areas into that, our refuges. So if anyone has questions about that, I'm happy to help you afterwards. Next.
Has that been updated on your website at all?
It is.
Perfect.
Yep, it is on our website. So this was prior to basically us moving our mapper layers out and completely acknowledging the pieces that we own. So this is prior, go ahead and advance. This is after kind of the navigable waters within our state. Next slide. Here's just a drilled in our Noatak National Preserve and Kobuk Valley Preserve. This was prior. This is what the federal government so far agrees. You'll see the main pieces are basically like the Kobuk and the Noatak, but not in their entirety. Okay, next slide. And this is after. So this is what, if you look at our map, what you'll see. And some of these pink or red areas, we are not sure they could actually be navigable, but it's going to take further study. The blue is what we're confident is navigable. So next slide. And then talking about this is Jim.
What we did with the, thank you, Kara, what we did with the navigable waters layer, right? Those earlier maps that we showed, where we have gone and we are in the process of doing all federal areas statewide and identifying, because we're tired of waiting for them to do this. And this is the lowest of low priorities for the federal government, is determining that the state-owned submerged lands in a federal area. That is below the bottom of their priorities because they love the ambiguity, right? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And until we say it is, we're going to treat it like it's non-navigable, right? That's been going on for long enough. So we're taking the initiative and we are deciding what belongs to the state. What we got at the date of statehood pursuant to the Equal Footing Doctrine, the Alaska Statehood Act, and the Federal Submerged Lands Act. And what we have done with that layer is also put it into a bill. So everything that you see on that layer references a description within a piece of legislation. The bills themselves are some 88, 90 pages long, where we just list them out one at a time. Using the RS 2477 model that was, that was utilized back in the early 1990s by the Alaska legislature, we are also listing what we believe to be state-owned submerged lands under navigable waters and tidally influenced waters within federal areas. This is Senate Bill 92, House Bill 98. Hopefully those are going to be coming up for hearing soon, and would encourage all of you to support this, because this is a very strong statement to be made by our legislature that this is sovereign state property. We got this as our birthright when we became a state. And by having our legislature do that, there's a number of strategic advantages, probably too numerous to go into. But just look at it this way. If Jim Walker and the pad section says it's navigable, the federal government is going, whoopee, so what, right? If our state legislature does so, that's a whole different thing. That's a pretty strong statement of what Alaskans believe they own. So we are actively working through that. Next slide, please, Caleb. As Kara indicated, we have in our first phase done all NPS areas statewide, all Forest Service areas statewide, plus the Tetland National Wildlife Refuge. If this bill is passed with that first tranche of waters, the bill also contains an annual reporting requirement. So at the beginning of each session, we will be going back and reporting on our work. So hopefully if it passes now, next session, we'll be going back and providing the information regarding the state-owned waters within the remaining U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service areas. After that, BLM lands, and then an ongoing quality assurance, quality control. You know, for example, as you saw on that map, you know, Karen said there was some uncertainty on our part far upstream. If we go to litigation on one of those, we are going to seek it up to the headwaters, up to the very last point of navigability. And should we win such a lawsuit as that, we would come back to the legislature and say, our entry on, you know, number 2,416 should be broader because we won that lawsuit. So there'll be this continuing quality assurance, quality control work. It also sets forth in statute very clearly what are the criteria that you are supposed to use under the law in determining navigability, right? So there's a lot of reasons for this bill, and one that is not readily apparent is this. The thought was, if we get this adopted in our Alaska Code, we are giving our congressional delegation, I know Senator Sullivan's office has been very interested in this, the necessary ammunition for them to say in federal legislation what the state said is navigable is in fact navigable. In other words, our state legislature can show the way, can lead the way in further federal legislation, and this will provide wonderful grist for that mill. Next slide, please. You want me to do this one?
This is a great.
Great.
I'll talk about this.
Good, you talk about this one.
This is one Jim and I cooked up a while ago and is ongoing. We're about to have, I think, a draft out of the 40-mile area state transportation management plan. So that's basically what I referenced earlier, where we're going to describe state ownership, management intent, interest in the navigable waters, and the network of 2477s in the area. So
Hopefully also in this 40-mile state transportation management plan, which is our pilot program. Hopefully we're gonna spread this out and do it across the state after we work out the kinks in an area that we know well, which is the 40-mile. The hope is that we can also include in that statements regarding generally allowed uses of state RS 2477s and state navigable waters, and would love for the input of groups like the AOC in helping us come to those conclusions, with the idea that once we have, through our planning process, said this is the way it's going to be, the federal government will be required to conform their planning efforts to it to the maximum extent possible. So again, we're trying to lead the way.
Yeah. It's basically a way for us to advance the ball in front of them, because they would not. For those of you that have interacted with planning, our federal planners will not put RS 2477s down in their plans, maps, or do any acknowledgement of them. They say that they need to go to court, and that's also not in, that's not what case law says, so. I know.
It was advised back to the department to change their record. She was like it 3 years later, they still have not done it, but can't get them to enforce them. So
Yeah.
Should they have the station agreement up on that?
Which is why we're moving things forward sort of on our own. Next slide.
Before you leave that one,
Yes.
yeah, before you leave that slide, this is a question that I've actually asked several times about the offensive, defensive position of the state. I've never understood, or had anybody answer the question, why the state doesn't just say that everything is navigable. Put the onus on the federal government, come back and prove us. It seems like we're fighting for every little navigable stream in the state, and I've never had that question answered. Maybe you can answer.
Well, that's actually pretty much what we're trying to do with what we call our Anilka Waters project, where we are doing a full check of the state and mile by mile, foot by foot, saying what we think is navigable, and now we publish it on a map. So now, in our view, we're publishing it to the public and all agencies. It's available to everyone. This is what the state says is navigable. Challenge us if you disagree. That is what we are now doing. We just haven't completely finished the state. I mean, it's huge, so we're working on that. Mhm.
Spent $300,000 of phone money until AOC got involved, and other agencies, other nonprofits, to put in the $1.2 million to do this. Are you guys going to stand behind somebody who goes out there and the Fed's going to say you're on not having waters?
Bill, a number one priority of the PAD team is to get between the federal government and the next John Sturgeon, because no one, or very few people, have the grit and wherewithal to be the next John Sturgeon, right? And there's no reason that an individual needs to put themselves in legal jeopardy. Sue me, don't sue him. We are doing our best to insert ourselves. And to go back to your question, through this map and this work that we're doing with the codification project and this Anilka Waters layer, the federal areas water layer, we're saying what we own. We're saying what's navigable. And if you don't like it, please, by all means, sue me. I will gladly accept service of process, because we are prepared to stand behind what is found on that navigable waters layer. We are prepared to go into court, because guess what? We will win. Yes, ma'am.
All right, here's an assertion, John Sturgeon question. So John Sturgeon, I'm doing a hypothetical. MPS just came out with some legal erroneous rules to eliminate arts methods. Okay. If John Sturgeon gets in his watercraft, goes up the Nation River that is navigable, and decides that he wants to shoot a caribou from his boat
okay? He's deemed a god-awful sport hunter under NPS rules, right? And legally, that's a legal harvest method passed by BOG, implemented by ADF and G. Is he legal to do that even though NPS has eliminated that harvest method?
I'm going to have to defer on that one. Now, there are very few questions I'm going to step away from. I will gladly interact with all of them. However, when you ask me questions about fish and game policy, that is not my expertise, right? And discussing, what you can do and what you can take pursuant to state law and federal law, I'm going to have to defer to my colleagues at Fish and Game. Now, I'll be happy to get your information afterwards and follow up with you or put you in contact with the right folks, but I really do not feel confident or competent to stand before you and opine about fish and game law in Alaska.
Elaine can expand on that. We know Senator Dan Sullivan is a huge, huge supporter of this, but what do we got to do to get Murkowski and Bertolo on board? They're both fighting this.
Well, the politics of it, that's a bit above my pay grade, okay? All I can do is control what I can control and make the fight that I can make. I do know that there is a lot of interest with our congressional delegation in incorporating that codification project that I discussed into some type of federal statutory or regulatory practice. I do know about the interest there. But in terms of asking, the larger political questions involved, that's way above my pay grade.
Okay. Thank you.
Next slide. Oh, sorry.
So when you were talking a few minutes ago about the state, getting in between the feds and the, being able to be there for you and not have, not have to be the next John Sturgeon, that's music to my ears. When I mentioned, the 2 times that I have been pestered by the feds, in that second case, that was, they weren't disputing that it was navigable. They're just telling me to leave. And so when that happens and I'm on the river, how should I handle that in light of this new development?
Be polite. Don't fight with them, okay? Don't hit them over the head with a beer bottle, as I know you will want to do. Be polite with them. If you can record the conversation, take notes. Call us up, okay? I'll be happy to leave contact information for everybody, but let us know. Give us particulars while it's still fresh. Who the law enforcement agent was, when did it occur, what time of day, where you were, GPS coordinates, the type of boats you were using, all of those types of details, and a recording would be wonderful. Because, as we mentioned, federal government is very, the federal government is very elusive in evading taking a position about ownership of submerged lands. They know that if they say, you don't own it, by the close of business, they will have a 180-day notice from the pad section on their desk. So they take the attitude instead, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We haven't decided, but until such time, I'll be right with you, Bill, until such time as they do, we're going to treat it like it's non-navigable. So anytime there is an action like what happened to you, Todd, it's the situation where they are, by their actions, asserting an ownership interest, which may give us the requisite standing by showing that there is an actual case in controversy that the federal courts have jurisdiction to resolve. Yes, sir, Bill.
So in his situation, they have told him, yeah, we think it's navigable, but we want you to leave. Does he leave? Does he have to leave?
I think it's probably a good idea. I don't think it's ever a good idea to get into it with someone with a badge and a gun. okay? From my perspective, if I were in your shoes, I would do my best to document it and keep my powder dry for another day, when I can go and avail myself of lawful remedies within the court system to vindicate the rights that you have and that all other Alaskans have. That would be wonderful. Absolutely. But I am always going to tell you to be polite and respectful and listen to the fella with the badge and the gun.
Question there.
I came in late, so this question may have been asked before, but is there any documentation that a person could find that they can actually carry with them before they go out there? So if there was a complication, that they could say, hey, this is what I read, and this is how I understand it.
We do have a lot of information on our website, but you would have to do kind of like a pre-research of where you're going before you go.
That's what I think I would.
Yeah, so we do have resources for that on our website. I wanted to talk quick and then move on to other slides about one of the most interesting projects we have going on with our RDI program. The PAD unit worked for years to bring this, and DNR as a whole, bring this to our state senators' attention, that we keep giving more and more funding. We, as in the federal government, was giving more and more funding to the BLM section that processes these, but nothing else was coming out the other side. And we did actually succeed in getting that office audited. That started in November. 4 or 5 auditors came from DC, and we spent several days with them, kind of going through, showing them our side of the story, a lot of our records, and a lot of our proof of lack of progress. And that's going to take them 12 to 18 months. We gave them some follow-up materials after that visit, and then there will actually be a full report that comes out, and they said most of the time their advice and recommendations are actually followed. So looking forward to that, kind of a new and interesting way to advance our work. Next slide. A recordable disclaimer of interest. That's that piece of paper we talked about earlier where we tell the BLM that we think something's navigable, and then hopefully with the package that we've submit with that, they come back and say, yes, you're right, here's your recordable disclaimer of interest. And then I'm gonna pass back to Jim to talk about our 2477s.
Rudd and Caleb, we're rapidly approaching the end there. I can move through this pretty quickly, but any guidance, I've got officially 3 minutes left. I don't think I can move that quickly. Just keep going?
Keep going.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about this moose here is getting its revenge on me. I didn't shoot you, but you were bound and determined to trip me up. Let's talk a little bit about RS-2477s and the work that we are doing with RS-2477s, which is also part of our statehood defense work, right? We presently have, and I want to give updates on some of the pending litigation and recently concluded litigation that I know is of interest to a lot of folks in this room. Our case against the federal government for RS-2477 rights-of-way in the Chicken area, specifically within the wild and scenic corridor of the 40-mile river, is still ongoing, right? We are still working our way through that case. So I can't really talk much about that one other than to say it's pending. I think many of you know about our total victory that we achieved on the Clutina Lake Road. It was litigation that was pending for quite some time and was finally successfully concluded after various trips to the Alaska Supreme Court and proceedings in the trial court. Again, it was total victory on behalf of the state of Alaska. It's, I think, a very important case, particularly because that is one of the few places that the average Alaskan can use our road system to get to a world-class fishery to fill their freezers. And, you know, the importance of maintaining that access to that world-class fishery is something I think is huge for the everyday Alaskan. We also finally concluded litigation in the Dixon case, which is the Iditarod Trail case. This involved several trips to the Alaska Supreme Court, but again, we secured a total victory in the state's behalf. We established some good precedent regarding uses of the RS-2477s and otherwise that we are going to be able to use for the advantage of all Alaskans again and again and again in subsequent cases. We also were awarded our attorney's fees and costs in that case. Lastly, we have various administrative RS-2477 determinations that are in the pipeline right now. We continue our work there. Next slide, please, Caleb. As Ryan Anderson, Commissioner Anderson said a few minutes ago, these slides just depict the importance of our RS-2477 network to all of us statewide. You know, the slide over on this side of the page depicts what we have in terms of highways and roadways in the states without RS-2477. And then this slide on this side of the page depicts the more robust transportation network that we have in the state thanks to the RS-2477 rights of way. Now, one of the things that we're frustrated with, and I know, and this is, I think, some of the same frustration that we have with navigable waters, is that we have historically litigated particular trails, right? You know, we've spent time on extensions of the Chicken Ridge Trail that go within the Wild and Scenic Corridor, for example. And we litigate and litigate and litigate those. But at the end of the day, we may be securing important precedent that we can use again and again, but we haven't really done much as a total in terms of clearing state title, clearing state ownership to a lot of miles of RS-2477s. So we've been racking our brains. How can we do this more efficiently? On the navigability side, as you can see from some of those cases that we have pending, we're looking at watershed quiet title actions, right? Where we are considering the Mulchatna, the Chillicothe, Turquoise Lake, Twin Lakes, Talakwana Lake, Talakwana River, all of these waters within a particular watershed. We're approaching it that way. That's the way we're trying to supercharge, if you will, our quiet title actions. How can we do the same with RS-2477s? And we've been thinking about it. And we were chewing on it and thinking, is there some way that in one single quiet title action, we could seek to clear state title to all RS-2477s within the entirety of a CSU, right? One action, all the RS-2477s within a CSU. This would be a way of jump-starting and moving forward those adjudications much more quickly. Next slide, please. We all know what the status quo looks like. The federal government categorically resists recognition of RS-2477s in CSUs and other federal areas under federal control, right? We see it in planning. We see it in the way that individuals are threatened with prosecution for using state-owned RS-2477s for motorized use and otherwise. We see it again and again and again. The stakes are quite high. So what have we done about it? We're getting ready to file a single quiet title act for the entirety of the Yukon-Charlie National Preserve, right? All of the known RS-2477s within that particular CSU. Why Yukon-Charlie? Several reasons. First, it has a long history of mining. Why is that important? Mining involves documents, right? It involves records, and these records are what we use to prove cases. With navigability litigation, the river speaks for itself in many respects. With trails, we have to speak for the trails. And so proving the historical usage through documentation provided in the mining area and otherwise is absolutely essential. We also believe that with this omnibus, if you will, civil action, we will be accomplishing various goals listed here. Next slide, please. Why did we also pick it? Well, this is John Sturgeon country, right? You know, this is where the Nation River is. This is where it all started. It seemed to make sense to start there. And most importantly, there are very few federal withdrawals in the area, right? Most of the land was open for entry, allowing for the perfection of an RS-2477 right-of-way until the land was withdrawn for the later creation of the Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve, which means we have a big window to prove acceptance of the RS-2477 grant. Next slide, please. This is just a map, and again, I'll be happy to talk with others because I'm over time right now. With others about it, but these are some of the RS-2477s involved, and you can see some of the mileage involved. So we are talking about hitting a big lick on behalf of the state of Alaska in terms of RS-2477s here. We have filed our 180-day notice in that litigation, or intended litigation, that will expire soon. We were out there last year doing field work. We'll be out again doing field work this summer and hope that in the fall, winter of 2023, we will be filing this action. Next slide, please. This one's going to take a little while. I know there are other speakers. Do you want me, probably 5 minutes, 10 minutes on this particular section, but this is something else. Tell me if you want me to okay, all right. I hate to encroach on others' time. Joint Reconciliation Initiative, right? Something else we're working on. It is not, per se a statehood defense initiative, but you'll see why I lumped it in here with what we're talking about today, okay? How do we start talking about this? Well, let's start talking about this in terms of how Alaska got its land, right? When we became a state, we got our land in two ways. One, our statehood land entitlement, right? That's over here. And then over here, pursuant to the equal footing doctrine of the United States Constitution that provided we received immediately upon becoming a state title to the submerged lands under navigable and tidally influenced waters statewide. So as we play this out, next slide, please, Caleb. This is all the lands that we got through the equal footing doctrine right here. Next slide. Laid over the top of it, these are our state selections to fulfill our land entitlement. You can see that there is a lot of overlap between the two, right? Where you have equal footing doctrine lands on top of lands selected by the state for its statehood land selections. In many and most of those selected lands, BLM did not meander out the navigable waters. They said, well, the state's getting it all anyway. Here you go. No sense doing all that extra work for a survey. The reason it's important is they're shortchanging us. Because we receive title pursuant to the equal footing doctrine, we don't need to spend our statehood land entitlement to get the lands. So we're being overcharged throughout the state. Now, this is something that we've known about for a while, but in the past, we have been unable to really put our arms around as a state the magnitude of this issue, right? Everybody knows it happens, but we don't have an idea of how many acres, how many miles we're talking about. Hence, we came up with this joint reconciliation project. Again, these are the points that I made about us being overcharged. Next slide, please. A similar scenario has also occurred on native corporation lands. On many of ANCSGA lands that were selected to fulfill entitlements, once again, BLM did not meander out the state-owned submerged lands. We saw in this fact an opportunity for partnership that we are presently pursuing. Next slide, please. What we have to do is, and what we have done, is identify all of these areas statewide where we have been overcharged as a state, or when native corporations were erroneously conveyed state-owned submerged lands, with the idea that many native corporations would rather have uplands than submerged lands, and particularly income-producing uplands as opposed to submerged lands. So, using photogrammetry and ArcGIS and something called the Strahler Stream Order classification, we have come up with a way of determining reasonably and repeatedly, an approach to identifying these lands. So if you don't want to believe me, federal government, go out and do it yourself. You will come up with the same numbers. Next slide. And again, this would show sort of how we did it. You identify an appropriate water body, and then, next slide, you see where the overlap is with the various, statehood selections and also native corporation selections. And then you ask the computer through ArcGIS to calculate the areas involved. Next slide. This is what it works out to. We know that we have been overcharged for over 95,000 acres, okay? We suspect, because this work is still ongoing, that there's another 120,000 to 175,000 additional acres. That means that's land that's still owed to us by the federal government on top of what they know about. Okay, next slide. Applying this same analysis to native corporation lands, we have reached the following: 77,000 acres of what we believe are state-owned submerged lands were wrongfully conveyed to native corporations. The top three corporations: Doyon with 18,000, Bristol Bay 17,000, Chalista with a little over 11,000. Next slide, please. This shows kind of the breakdown of all of the various native corporations. We met with the land managers of all of the regional corporations on the last day of November and laid all this out to them and said, this is a way that we can work together vis-a-vis the federal government to get more lands for your corporations, and also at the same time get it right in terms of what the state has coming to it. We are having breakout meetings with various ones of the individual corporations, drilling down and showing what it looks like for them. But together, if we do this and this works, this will be a wonderful way for the state to assert against the federal government remaining lands that are entitled and that it is entitled and have been deprived. Next slide, please. Again, all of this fits into a larger strategy that we know as statehood defense. It is very important to this administration. Our governor has shown a lot of leadership on these areas, which we are very appreciative of, and has really in charge my team, the Department of Law, all of the other various sections of state government with achieving these things that will benefit not only all Alaskans today, but all Alaskans in the future in perpetuity. Thank you.